The idea that there are absolutes, there's an absolute church, an absolute art system, an absolute politic, doesn't seem to make any sense now. As we pull back the covers of our reality and find that, in fact, indeed, chaos is a far more accurate picture of what we are and how we live than all those defined ideas of this is the right way and this is the wrong way. Those things seem so impractical and something that actually doesn't describe our situation.
In 1995, 5 years before the millennium, David Bowie released Outside, or One Outside, the Nathan Adler Diaries, a hypercycle. In 1972, Bowie's starman Ziggy Stardust came to Earth to warn us that we only had 5 years left to cry in. Here in Outside, however, it is not the well-meaning Ziggy who appears, but rather 7 very different, much more ambiguous characters, victims, artists, murderers, who stalk through the streets of an incoherent cityscape, slouching towards Bethlehem on the eve of the millennium. The original idea for the album, and the reason it is called One Outside, was that it was to be the first of a series of albums about the final years of the millennium. And as all the clocks ran down on a century in society, turning and turning in the widening gyre, hurtling into the unknown. The end of the century, as Bowie imagined it, was a time of chaos and incoherence, of things falling apart, and of all the old centers, such as religion or morality, refusing to hold, and a new paganism, one built on drugs and art and blood rituals, rising to replace it. But the album is not prophecy or prediction. It is not about the future. Instead, it is capturing, or attempting to capture, the feel and texture of life in the final days of the century. Outside is a concept album. The story, such as it is about the murder and dismemberment of baby Grace Blue, a 14-year-old girl, and Nathan Adler, a detective professor with the Art Crimes Unit, who is investigating her death. In the world Bowie imagines, art and crime blur together, and murder becomes an imaginative act. In the liner notes, the album includes a short story Bowie wrote called The Diary of Nathan Adler, or The Art Ritual Murder of Baby Grace Blue, a non-linear Gothic drama hypercycle. It describes the murder and ritual display of baby Grace's body. The torso, by means of its bottommost orifice, had been placed on a small support fastened to a marble base. It was shown to varying degrees of success depending upon where one stood from behind the web, but in front of the museum door itself, acting as both signifier and guardian to the act. It was definitely murder, but was it art? The other characters in Outside, the suspects in the investigation, are Leon Blank, Algeria Touch Shriek, and Ramona A. Stone, any one of whom might be the artist/minotaur, the one who dismembered and displayed baby Grace. The songs on Outside are, in a very loose way, sung from the different characters' perspectives, and between the songs, Bowie includes several spoken word segues from the different characters. As with Bowie's other concept albums, like Ziggy Stardust or Diamond Dogs, the concept here is loose, elusive, and suggestive, more a collection of thematically related songs than a tightly developed narrative. Most of the songs function as individual pieces that fit together to form a whole, as if each were itself a body part, attached but also detachable. The incoherence of the story seems deliberate, as even the idea of a story falls apart, and not surprisingly, the murder is never solved. While death and murder and blood feature prominently on the album, Outside is really a meditation on art. And when you look at some of the things happening in performance art in the 90s, it is not hard to see why Bowie would make the leap from art to murder, or the leap to seeing murder as art. Perhaps the end of each century is tumultuous and chaotic. I don't know, I've only lived through one. But the 90s seemed particularly obsessed with the idea of things ending and with the loss of meaning that end suggests. Performance artists around the world were using their own and other people's bodies to stage more and more extreme displays of ritual body art, smashing through taboos and conventions in what seemed to many people to be an ever-escalating attempt to destroy not just the idea of art, but the idea of ideas themselves. As if all our philosophy and ideology and morality, everything that had seemed to give us meaning, had never been anything other than an illusion. Damien Hirst was suspending in formaldehyde whole animals like sheep and sharks. Herman Nitsch was recreating blood rituals with whole groups of people by gutting pigs and covering themselves with the blood and viscera. I'm not actually going to show you pictures of that because it's pretty fucked up. Ron Athey was on stage cutting shapes and characters into a black man's back and then pressing towels into the wounds to make art prints. Each of these artists and several others are explicitly mentioned in the Nathan Adler diaries. Bodies, alive or dead, were being used to make art, or, if you don't believe this sort of thing is art, and you are allowed to think that, they were being used to comment on art and the boundaries it establishes. Bowie, skeptical but intrigued, was following all of this, squinting at it like Detective Professor Nathan Adler and trying to figure out, but was it art?
What fascinates you about that and artists that are into this scene?
I'm not so sure that the thing actually fascinates me as much as I see it more as an artistic trend, and that's the aspect of it that interests me, is why. And my own take on it is that as we enter into this final phase of the millennium, that there's almost because possibly the Judeo-Christian ethic doesn't actually embrace our feelings and our fears of sex and violence, that it really ends up in the area of popular culture.
In Outside, as art becomes crime and crime becomes art, homicide detectives become art critics, and Adler is not just trying to solve the murder, but also establish whether the murder has any imaginative merit. And he seems a bit like an enthusiast, as if he thinks, yes, some murder is art. What a fantastic death abyss, he exclaims at the end of The Heart's Filthy Lesson. But in the 1990s, it was not just on the strange and unfamiliar fringes of performance art that such questions were being asked. Mainstream art, too, seemed obsessed with the aesthetics of death and the way the human body could be manipulated to say something.
That expires in 1 week. You're not real FBI, are you?
The Silence of the Lambs, a 1991 film directed by Jonathan Demme and starring Jodie Foster and Sir Anthony Hopkins, a movie about a psychiatrist turned cannibal and that featured a serial killer skinning women to make his own woman suit.
He's making himself a woman's suit, Mr. Crawford, out of real women.
Won the Academy Award for Best Picture.
What exactly was the point of the conversation you were about to get into?
Don't know.
And the 1995 film Seven, directed by David Fincher and starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, another serial killer movie, this one about a series of grotesque killings patterned on the 7 deadly sins, shocked audiences with its gothic, Dantean cruelty. Both films are brilliant. but both require quite a strong stomach. So please don't watch them and then be like, my English teacher scarred me for life. What both films investigated, and what makes both of them so disturbing and unnerving, is how they use dead human bodies as aesthetic objects and as the material for a grotesque artistry. Taken on their own, any one of these things, Hearst's Dead Sheep or David Fincher's Seven, probably suggests very little. Taken as a movement or trend, however, and when we see them not as discrete odd aberrations, but as ideas, insistently and uncomfortably working their way through the intestines of a culture, they reveal a deeply unsettled sense that we had lost something, lost the center, and lost whatever it was that had been holding us together. Here we are, turning and turning in the widening gyre, falcons who no longer believe there is a falconer. That's not to say that everything in the 90s was about death and chaos. Firmly in the mainstream was a bright cheerfulness that was probably both true and covering up our unease. But it is often the fringes and the margins that really reveal what is going on. And what was going on in the 90s was a deep unease about the possible meaninglessness of life, and about the license such meaninglessness might afford us. And it probably makes sense that art in the 90s would reveal this. It was not just in the imaginative world of art, mainstream or otherwise, that the blood-dimmed tide was loosed. The news was dominated by incoherent images of death and collapse. The Gulf War opened the 90s, and it was the first truly televised war, a war people could watch from their living rooms, blurring the lines between entertainment and reality. The O.J. Simpson murder trial tore down the myth of American fame, as we literally all watched success and celebrity run itself into the ground on the freeway. Here in Canada, the horrific Paul Bernardo murder trial scarred a nation that could no longer pretend depravity was something consumed and enjoyed on screen. And the Columbine school shooting forever changed the world we lived in, and made it a world where children can kill children.
We're getting shot all around me. There was a guy at a table right next to us, next to me and her, and they just shot him, and then walked away, and then he was just sitting there in a pool of blood.
Looming over everything, especially in the final years of the decade, was the threat that everything was going to end. The December 31st, 1999, the day baby Grace Blue was murdered in Outside, would in fact be the last day, and that Y2K would kill us all, either in a nuclear holocaust as computers failed, or through an actual holocaust as God rained down apocalyptic judgment on a world gone so wrong. Why am I talking about all this instead of Outside? Well, because all of this is what Outside is about. Outside has a story and it has characters, yes, but both of these are vehicles for a more elusive tenor. Art reflects the world. Art uncovers something about the world. Art holds up a mirror to the world. Art, true art, whatever that means, is always connected to the time and place where it was created. Someone like Bowie soaks up the world around him and then projects it back at us. Not in a neutral or automatic way, but in a way that filters everything through the imagination. Outside taps into the time, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. Art does not just suddenly appear. Art does not just suddenly appear. It is intimately connected with the flesh and the blood of the world. Outside articulates what some people were feeling in the 90s. The apocalyptic and nihilistic loss of meaning. Songs like The Heart's Filthy Lesson, No Control, I'm Deranged, and Through These Architects' Eyes investigate the connection between art and the world and how one influences the other. But when it comes to art, and maybe but when it comes to art, and maybe when it comes especially to music, there is another connection I want to make. The personal one. The connection we ourselves as individual readers, listeners, and viewers make with the art that we enjoy, consume, live inside. In this crash course for the ravers, I have been approaching Bowie through a mostly academic and critical lens, approaching each album as an abstract art object, something to be scrutinized and analyzed, which is of course what we as scholars do. That's our thing. That's kind of our whole thing. But this is not how music is experienced in our daily lives. Subjecting an album to this sort of scrutiny is, in many ways, unnatural, artificial, a form of art unto itself. Music, however, especially music, is woven into the texture of our lives. We dance to it, bang our heads to it, fall asleep to it. We are dimly but comfortably aware of it as the background soundtrack to our lives. And that is how I feel about Outside. It is woven into me. Outside will always be close to my heart because it was my first Bowie album. It was my entry point into Bowie's world. It came to me, or I came to it, not because I intentionally sought it out. We met accidentally, and we were strangers when we met. I found Bowie in 1997 or 98, and I found him because I watched the movie Seven, a movie I love, if for no other reason than because of this introduction. I was a teenager at the time, and my awareness of the worlds of art, movies, music, literature was pretty limited at the time. But it was expanding, much, I assume, like it is for you. These first few years at university, remote university or not, are a time of rapid expansion and growth and exposure just to so much that you weren't aware of. Seven's opening credits play over a remixed version of Nine Inch Nails' Closer. And I was already a Nine Inch Nails fan and hooked. But the film, when it finally concludes and when audiences are feeling battered and broken by what they have just seen, concludes with The Heart's Filthy Lesson. And I was transfixed. I learned that David Bowie had been working and touring with Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails. Reznor remixed The Heart's Filthy Lesson and I'm Afraid of Americans, even appearing in the video for that song, which was originally supposed to be on Outside, but landed up in the follow-up album, Earthling. Reznor also remixed I'm Deranged for David Lynch's 1997 film Lost Highway, another film I love. Wait, David Bowie? David Fincher? David Lynch? What's up with Davids? At the time, I didn't know that David Bowie had already had a very long career and that his style and approach changed from album to album. I didn't know that I was meeting him at a very specific moment in his career when he was fed up with the mainstream and looking to the fringe for inspiration. And when I did listen to some of his other albums, like Ziggy Stardust or Station to Station, albums that I now really love, the teenage me who only wanted dark and industrial music was disappointed to learn that Bowie wasn't in fact the British Trent Reznor. I was ready for Outside, but I was not ready for Low or Heroes. But like Bowie himself, I was not static. None of us are. I, as a listener and a person, would change and mutate over the years, turning from one thing into another. Not so much outgrowing one style of music as expanding and incorporating new ones. And it is here, in these accidental and elusive chance meetings, personal connections with an artist or a musician or an author, and here in the way that music changes and changes us, or how we change and therefore change music, that the real value lies. Not the academic value that we investigate in classes like this, but the close personal value that feeds into our lives. Outside is a dark meditation on art and experience in the 90s by a man almost 50 years old at the time. A brooding and sinister look at incoherence and chaos. It is about the end of the world. But it was also, for me at least, about the beginning of a world. And it has since become, for me, a paradoxically joyous celebration, an album about murder that I will be forever grateful for. Bowie never went on to continue or conclude the hyper cycle, and Baby Grace's murder remains unsolved. Given who Bowie was, it was probably always something of a self-delusion to think he'd do the same thing for 5 albums in a row. The 1997 follow-up, Earthling, continued some of the musical themes and styles established in Outside, but dropped the concept. Bowie moved on. He always does. But when the new millennium did come, a millennium Bowie was actually very optimistic about, thinking we would leave behind the chaos and incoherence of a dying century. It was almost immediately traumatized by the events in New York City. Events that would set the tone for the coming century and that had nothing to do with art.